Wolverine historically was one of the X-Men who rarely changed costumes due to the functionality of his suits and how they complement his mutant abilities. But as times change in which we read the comics, so does what he wears during the comic adventures that he finds himself written into. Specific costumes will be commented on, from their origins to their features to complement Logan's powers and abilities. When Wolverine first debuted in The Incredible Hulk, the original costume isn't all that much different from the iconic yellow costume that defined the character. The only real difference is in the anatomical mask details. Visually, it looked like the Wolverine animal in which the character was named for. But instead of it being likened to a Wolverine, many thought of it being based on that of a cat or feline, so the whiskers on the mask were called or looked back upon as quote-unquote cat whiskers, which were not necessarily good for a mysterious and rugged character that Wolverine was set up for in Chris Claremont's 1970s Uncanny X-Men stories. But everything else in terms of details about the costume have had positive reception. Co-creator Len Wein also originally intended for Wolverine's claws to be an attachment of Logan's gloves and not be a part of his forearm bones at all, as later on this became an iconic and monumental part of the character in terms of abilities and costume function. Later on, when Wolverine joined the X-Men in Giant Size X-Men issue 1, according to popular belief, Gil Kane drew the mask for the costume differently by accident, turning the ears on Logan's costume similar to that of Batman in terms of anatomical detail, and blank eyes, which were different from the original yellow concept which had full eyes clearly visible. Besides those features, the costume was completely the same to the yellow concept. Looking more ferocious and striking, the then artist of the comic, Dave Cockrum, thought that the concept was so interesting that he went back and redrew his own panels featuring Wolverine in costume to match the anatomical accident by Kane. Eventually, the costume accident became to be the preferred choice by both comic readers and comic staff alike. The costume was mostly that of tights, not exactly armor for extra protection. Later versions of the classic gave it slightly thicker resistance to handle Wolverine's somewhat extreme villains or environments or even situations that he found himself in. His claws originally just extended and retracted through tiny holes on his outer hand. Later versions of the costume had metallic ports where the costumes were visibly seen extending from, even these metallic ports on the back of his hand being a bodily feature not technically related to his costume or gloves. In terms of aesthetic for a comic book character, in terms of originality, functionality, and cosmetic appeal, it's one of the greatest costumes ever conceived for any X-Men. Creative differences and controversy have always existed between writers, artists, and editors of the X-Men comics for most of its history. When Dave Cockrum left the Uncanny X-Men with issue 107, he thought it to be humorous and insulting to leave the next artist with a complex costume to draw for the late 1970s. The details aesthetically and dynamically were so complex that Cockrum's design was a quote-unquote a bitch to draw. New artist John Byrne wouldn't have any of it and quickly complained to editors about this fact and that it would be easier to depict the character by reverting back to the classic yellow outfit. The Fang costume wasn't exactly bad or unfavorable, just that in the late 1970s, details such as that were somewhat hard to achieve. Though such were being done in other Marvel comics at the time, for Wolverine to be highly drawn and detailed with the features anatomically of his costume whenever he wore it in any literal comic panel with the character would be too much of a time-consuming task to perform. John Byrne apparently wasn't a fan of the classic yellow design as well, and due to Byrne's creative influence over the comics in the early 1980s, he was allowed to redesign the costume with Uncanny X-Men issue 139. The sleeve design was changed for something similar to a second skin sort of visual appearance and feel, and owing to Logan's extreme body hair, The flesh tones on his arm were changed to a more realistic depiction of body hair on the arms. The brown costume in terms of appearances within Marvel Comics is historically the longest in the character's history when compared with all other costumes in terms of the character wearing it time-wise during comic adventures and stories. Besides the classic yellow, the most well-known for the character is the brown Byrne redesign. When Wolverine first got his solo comic book miniseries in the late 1980s, artist John Buscema gave Wolverine a Japanese ninja-inspired black costume, and to conceal his identity, he wore simple face paint. Back in the main Uncanny X-Men comic, he wore the brown costume. The black costume didn't have much in terms of aesthetics or appeal. It was just skin-tight bodysuit that did not necessarily do much for him, just simply for appearance and for the early Japanese-themed stories of original solo series. For a then modern complete relaunch of the X-Men comics, the characters wore designs inspired by the original 1960s uniforms, but these costumes did not last long as Wolverine soon reverted back to more familiar costumes, to be seen in stories and to be reflected on by fans. Not exactly a costume, but the visuals of Logan being within the Weapon X program is worth mentioning because it had Logan essentially being in the nude with sensors attached to his body to measure various bodily functions and other essential features. When staff decided to have Wolverine return to the classic yellow, it would be a nearly identical shift back to the design from the 1970s, but aspects of it were modernized, such as longer ears, longer shoulder pieces on the costume, visible body hair from Byrne's costume redesign, his belt changed from being essentially a muscle belt to a more uniform-inspired belt with the X logo, small claw hole ports on the back of his hands for his claws to extend and retract from. All of these anatomical details became standard within Wolverine costume portrayals. Going back into Wolverine's convoluted history, his outfit with Team X had a complete Special Operations Commando sort of appearance and feel with the skin suit and armor. Commentators looking back on the costume have said that the excess use of pouches owed to the mid-1980s to early 1990s influence of American action-themed films. In X-Men issue 25, Magneto used his powers to extract the adamantium from Wolverine's skeleton. It revealed what some fans had thought all along, that his claws were actually forearm bones that could be extended and retracted by mental command, and that the bone claws weren't as effective as the adamantium-enriched claws. Though the concept was interesting for the character, comic readers and even some writers didn't think that the idea had long-term implications, and soon it was reconned, with adamantium being returned to him. The drastic changes for the Age of Apocalypse design actually had much praise due to how different it was when compared with what the character of Wolverine or Logan had worn in terms of a costume up until that time. Being of a blue and red hue, Wolverine looked more animalistic, with much like what occurred with him in the Weapon X program, but added to the whole situation of the Age of Apocalypse. It showed what Wolverine would or could look like without a left hand, or even one of his hands missing in general, and how his forearm is just metal covering the adamantium claw appendages. It should be known that prior to Hugh Jackman's portrayal of Wolverine or Logan in film, aspects of the character were completely different from what became standard in terms of portrayal for comics. There were never any absolute facts in terms of exact dimensions of Logan's height, just that he was short, usually around 1.5 meters or roughly 5'3", and visibly having body hair, his physical stature being that of muscular and compact or stocky. Jackman didn't have much visible body hair. He was 1.8 meters or roughly 6'2", and slim yet physically muscular. These attributes of Jackman's physical appearance would have dramatic changes for the character of Wolverine after the poorly received 20th Century Fox X-Men films released in the early to mid-2000s. In the films, Jackman's Wolverine had the leather suit that became common in the comics, despite long-term readers disliking the dynamics and appearance of the leather. Fox and Marvel forced the costume changes so that casual movie audiences could relate to the films if they were to read the said comics. The most visible change from the films in relation to the comics is the placement of his adamantium claws. From being forearm bones that extend and sheath from the openings on the back of his hand painlessly, it was changed to being forearm bones that extend and retract through the skin, barely displacing the knuckles, causing pain each and every extension and retraction. The said skin where the claws extended through heal instantaneously. Added to that, the film version could only use the claws with a clenched fist. While in comics, with the claws being on the back of the hand, Logan's hands were free to open and close depending on the situation and or at his personal preference. The film version also had Wolverine not wear a mask with his costume, as costume-wise, suit-wise, with relation to the film, it was decided that Jackman looked better without it. First debuting soon after the first X-Men film was released in 2000, a short-lived but new interpretation of the comics had it that the Evolution costume being inspired directly by the Byrne redesign and modernizing it. Certain dimensions of the costume were angled, including giving pseudo-military boots and an orange with black design. The costume actually turned out to be very well received, and critics as well as writers and artists connected to the X-Men comics believed it to be rather good in terms of originality and function for the character. The ultimate design was based off the Byrne redesign as well, but the color schematics were based on the Fang concept by Cockrum. The long-term belief of Wolverine having a mask was also abandoned, due in part to the films, and the costume was touted at the time of being a reboot for new readers, but new fans were actually partly inspired by the Evolution's costume in terms of preference, and the Ultimate version wasn't well received. Grant Morrison's X-Men run is considered one of the most divisive in modern times, with connection to the X-Men comics in terms of story and character portrayal. Highly influenced by the X-Men films, this costume was a combination of the film's dynamics for the character and temporarily putting the quote-unquote knuckle claws into the comics. In terms of functionality for the character, this is actually one of the least useful and innovative designs, mostly due once again to attract casual movie watchers to read said comic books, which critics now say did not necessarily work. In Season 3 of X-Men Evolution, Wolverine's costume was redesigned with a more sleek aspect in mind. Once again taking details from the films, the concept artists for Evolution decided on a mostly black costume with cosmetic aspects from the comics, such as a yellow color and X-Men logos. The belt that Logan wore, as well as his boots, had pouches and straps, giving a special operations sort of military feel. As mentioned, the Ultimate costume wasn't that much liked, and as a result of the popularity of X-Men Evolution, the costume seen in the cartoon was adopted for the comics. The only noticeable difference, essentially, were the stripes being of an inverted color on his shoulders, and the belt he wore, depending on the artist, that was attached to the comic at the time of publishing. Writers later decided to return Wolverine to a more classic look with the Astonishing costume, actually taking details from the original yellow concept, with smaller ears and more visual features to the original costume concept. Also the fact that the classic yellow design had a light blue hue. The Astonishing blue was actually slightly more darker in terms of color pigmentation in his suit. For X-Force missions in the early 2000s, stories of X-Force Wolverine wore a specifically made stealth suit for special operations. The costume dynamics and concepts were based on the Byrne design and stealth ninja costumes of the 1980s. Aesthetically, the costume was more liked than the Astonishing in some examples, with critics mentioning this at the time. With the reintegration of X-Men characters into the Marvel Comics universe following years of editorial back and forth arguments from 20th Century Fox over the film rights of the X-Men related media, Wolverine was brought back in an interesting outfit heavily designed by prior costumes. Seen in a number of issues, the costume is actually very much like the iconic Byrne redesign of the 1980s, with surprising details that some commentators have attributed to the X-Men Evolution costume from the early 2000s, with extra plating on the forearms and boots, giving a similar military feel and overall appearance with relation to the cartoon at the time. However, the dynamics of the brown and yellow in attributes to the design and depiction of the costume in the issues at the time varied depending on the House of X or Powers of X. Discussions by comic readers put out reasons for the costume being similar to both the 1980s and early 2000s is that with the first real launch of the X-Men in the early 2020s since the 1990s, writers and editors desired to appeal to all sorts of fans in acknowledging the previous stories and related media that were presented in past decades. The costume and its visual appeal with connections to the stories of the time were received well.